Hello there, and welcome back to another episode of Exploring American Literature. I am your host, Eliza Vargas, and today we will be continuing our discussion on the Norton Anthology of American Literature. Now, this is in fact one of my favorite pieces of anthologies, and when we last left off, we were discussing genres and how authors use different genres, to discuss themes and main ideas throughout their works. Now I know what you're saying, but Mr. Vargas, what exactly is a genre? Well, fret not, my friends. It's simple. A genre is any category of works of literature. They are often categorized by similarities in form or style of how they are written. Now, there are of course many themes that we can talk about, but today I'm only going to focus on three. Those being the short story, the poem, and the historical narrative. Now, my aim in this episode is to illustrate how authors can use any genre, really, to capture the same mood or the same theme. Now, for this illustration, I will be using the theme of death and loss. And we will be exploring how authors of these three genres have been able to capture this theme and this idea of death and loss, while still, remaining in their respective genre. The first example is the short story. Now, the first example we'll be using for the short story is The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. As we've discussed in a previous episode, Poe's own life was riddled with death and loss, and you can see how the events of his life impacted the style of his writing and the themes he chose to discuss. Now, the Raven follows the speaker of the short story, and he is dealing with loss. He is dealing with the death of his loved one. And in this short story, the Raven represents that sense of loneliness, the isolation, and how it can haunt you, much like how the Raven haunts the protagonist of the short story.
Open here I flung the shutter, when, with many a flirt and flutter, in stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not an instant stopped or stayed he, but, with mane of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird, beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven,
Hey, nevermore, my boy. Nevermore, my boy. Don't even worry about it.
But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did not outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave, as my hopes have flown before. Quoth the raven,
Nah, nevermore, my boy. You tripping. You jolly tripping, my boy. Now, these two different stanzas from the short story both illustrate how the protagonist is having difficulties dealing with the loss of his loved one. And we see at first he is curious, even playful with the pigeon. However, that curiosity quickly turns into frustration, turns into anger, turns into irrationality when he soon discovers that the bird, the raven, is as is as ambiguous as his feelings of isolation, as his feelings of grief as a result of losing his loved one. It's interesting. The short story is written as a series of stanzas, but it's still very clear the mood and the themes that Poe was building up in these lines. For my next example, we'll be using a poem by Anne Bradstreet called Before the Birth of One of Her Children.
No ties so strong, no friends so dear and sweet, but with death's parting blow is sure to meet. If any worth or virtue were in me, let that live freshly in thy memory.
Now, both Poe and Anne Bradstreet tackle the topic, the heavy and dense subject of death and grieving differently. Poe lets the subject hard in his heart. You can see how the grief and the loss, how he gets wrapped up in the isolation. Anne Bradstreet, on the other hand, has a much more optimistic, uplifting view of it. She urges listeners in her poem to remember the good memories, the good times, the virtue she had. Now, my final and last example, the historical narrative. We go back into the colonial times to Merle Rowlandson and her epic narrative of how she survived being captured by the American Indians.
No sooner were we out of the house, but my brother-in-law, being before wounded, in defending the house, in or near the throat, fell down dead. Whereat the Indians scornfully shouted, and the hallowed, and were presently upon him, stripping off his clothes. The bullets flying thick. One went through my side, and the same, as would seem, through my bowels, and the hand of my dear child in my arms. One of my elder sister's children, named William, had his leg broken, which the Indians, perceiving, they knocked him on his head. Thus were butchered by those merciless heathen, standing amazed, with the blood running down our heels. My eldest sister, being yet in the house, and seeing those woeful sights, and infants hauling mothers one way, and their children another, the same wallowing in their blood, and her elder son telling her that her son William was dead, and myself was wounded, she said,
Lord, let me die with them.
My voice hurts, so I'm not doing the accent anymore. But in the historical narrative, you can see how Merle Rowlandson uses imagery, and she uses, all these vivid details of the death surrounding her. And you just see the impact that, the impact that the loss had on her, not only her, but also on her sister. I think the line, Lord, let me die with them, is really impactful. It really shows how the sister was dealing with death and loss, and also how Merle Rowlandson was dealing with death and loss. This example is it's more straightforward than the other two. The other two examples were very stylistic, had a lot of poetic devices, but Merle Rowlandson, she paints the picture of this murder, of this death, and really this sets up the rest of her story. And it's interesting to see how she plays with these themes from a more straightforward lens, not really trying to be poetic or anything, just really describing what happened. Yeah. So in conclusion, we've seen how 3 different authors are able to tackle the same theme and the same key ideas from completely different angles. They each play into the strengths of their respective genres that they've chosen to write in, using the literary devices that are associated with each genre. And it's plain to see that there's not one better genre that's better at capturing a mood or a theme, that they're all equally as good and they're all equally as effective. It all just depends on, who's using that genre to tell what they want to say. And I think the 3 examples that I've chosen are very effective at getting their theme across. And I hope you guys enjoyed my multi-genre project.